You've likely seen this person in your own organization. They perform exceptionally well, they deliver consistently, and they always seem deeply committed. But underneath all that, their professional equilibrium often rests on a very fragile foundation. Today, we're going to deconstruct this common archetype, the validation seeker.
Here's the path we'll take in this explainer. First, we'll look at the paradox of this high performer. Then, we'll dig into their core drivers and behaviors. We'll analyze the consequences for leadership, explore the powerful alternative of emotional independence, and finally, contrast their approach with the pursuit of real, enduring influence. So let's start by unpacking this paradox. We all know this person. On the surface, they might just be the most reliable member of the team. Their work is often impeccable, and their commitment seems absolute. But this outward appearance of strength actually conceals a critical vulnerability. They're the first to take on new projects, and usually the last to leave the office. Now, while this looks like pure ambition, it's also a strategy. It creates more opportunities to be seen, to be acknowledged, and ultimately to be praised. You know, that colleague who instantly raises their hand for the tough assignment that has high visibility with the leadership team. Their work is polished to an exceptional standard. Every single detail is considered, every potential flaw is addressed. This goes beyond simple professionalism. It's an attempt to create something so flawless that it's beyond criticism and practically guarantees positive feedback. For any presentation or meeting, they are meticulously prepared. They've thought through every possible question, every contingency. This exhaustive preparation is really a control mechanism. It's designed to minimize uncertainty and maximize the chances of a perfect, praiseworthy performance. And this is where we get to the heart of the paradox. When that appreciation comes, they're energized, they're motivated. But if it's absent, their sense of professional worth just quietly erodes. You see, their confidence isn't self-generated. It's borrowed from the opinions of others. So let's put a formal name to this archetype. A validation seeker is someone whose internal engine runs on external fuel. Their self-worth isn't a constant. It's a variable, and it's directly tied to the approval they get from managers, peers, and the organization as a whole. This brings us to the central question we really have to consider. Is all of this high performance a sign of genuine professional confidence, or is it a symptom of an emotional dependency, a dependency on the applause of an audience? To truly understand this archetype, we have to look beneath the surface. We need to examine the psychological drivers that are fueling this constant need for approval. It's about the why behind the what. This slide lays out a very clear contrast. On one side, you have the validation-driven professional. Their motivation is external praise. Because of this, they often react defensively to critical feedback. It feels like a threat to their confidence, which comes from others' opinions. On the other side, you have the internally driven professional. Their motivation comes from their own standards of excellence. They're receptive to feedback because they see it as just data for improvement. Their confidence, you see, is rooted in their own self-assessment. Now, the behavior of one person is never truly isolated. It creates a ripple effect. So let's turn our attention to the wider consequences of this validation-seeking behavior, especially when these individuals find themselves in positions of leadership. Here we see the fundamental trade-off. In the short term, the gains are obvious. The individual gets praised, the team gets reliable results, and the organization sees consistent delivery. But the long-term risks are significant. The individual faces burnout and emotional fragility. The team develops a fear of giving honest feedback, which stifles innovation because no one wants to point out a flaw and have it taken personally. And ultimately, the organization ends up with a dependent culture and critical gaps in authentic leadership. Recognizing the problem is the first step. The next is to build a more sustainable alternative. So this section is about emotional independence, the foundation for a much more resilient professional identity. So what exactly is emotional independence? Well, it's the ability to maintain a stable sense of your own value and competence, regardless of the day-to-day ups and downs of external feedback. It means your professional self-worth is owned by you, not rented from others. And here's the crucial part. This is a skill that can be developed. The path involves 3 key practices. First, developing your own internal metrics for what good work actually looks like to you. Second, actively practicing self-validation, taking a moment to acknowledge your own efforts and achievements. And third,
learning to separate feedback on your work from judgments about your fundamental identity. This brings us to our final section. You see, emotional independence isn't just a defensive strategy. It's the platform from which true, lasting professional impact is built. It's about consciously shifting your goal away from seeking applause and toward earning respect. And here is the final critical distinction. The pursuit of validation is fundamentally about being liked. Its focus is on short-term praise, and its result is fleeting applause. The pursuit of influence, on the other hand, is about being respected. Its focus is on creating long-term impact, even if that means making difficult or unpopular decisions. The result isn't applause, but an enduring legacy. And so we conclude with a question for you to reflect on. As you navigate your own professional journey, it's worth asking yourself, what is the true metric of your success? Is it the immediate sound of applause, or is it the quiet, lasting weight of your influence? Today, we're going to take a closer look at a deeply ingrained psychological structure that affects so many high-achieving professionals. It's what we could call the architecture of external validation. Think of it as this invisible framework that can make even your biggest accomplishments feel, well, a little empty without someone else's approval. And that brings us to a really central question, one that a lot of leaders and top performers quietly ask themselves. You can have a fantastic track record, all the data points to your confidence, but you still feel this sense of unease. Why is that? Why can our confidence be so easily shaken? This is something we can call the high performer's paradox. It's that strange experience of delivering strong, consistent results, but still feeling a nagging self-doubt when you're not getting constant praise from the outside. The logic just doesn't seem to add up, does it? If the performance is solid, shouldn't the confidence be just as robust? To really understand this paradox, we actually have to look beyond the boardroom, beyond the latest performance review. See, the architecture for this way of thinking, it's rarely built during our professional lives. Its foundations are almost always laid much, much earlier. This quote really is the crucial starting point. Let's focus on that key phrase: performance determined approval. Now, this isn't just about simple encouragement. It's describing a conditional relationship, a situation where affection or safety or acceptance was directly tied to your ability to perform. In those kinds of early environments, the mind, in its effort to just navigate the world, learns a very subtle but incredibly powerful mental formula. It's an internal logic that starts to govern how we understand our own value and self-worth. Okay, so the first part of this formula is simple enough. When you achieve something, you get a good grade, you win a game, you perform well, you receive praise. A positive action leads to a positive external reaction. That connection is logical, and it's pretty easy for developing mind to grasp. Now, this second step, this is where things get a lot more interesting. The mind doesn't just stop at acknowledging the praise. It takes that external reaction and internalizes it as a direct measure of personal value. Suddenly, praise isn't just feedback anymore. It becomes the proof of your intrinsic worth. And here, you can see the complete chain reaction. You pursue an achievement, that generates praise, and then that praise is consumed as proof of your worth. Over years and years, this three-step process becomes an automatic, unconscious loop. It really solidifies into a core belief system about how you earn your place in the world. So let's examine what happens when this pattern evolves over time. What happens when you've been running this internal program for decades? Well, the consequences are profound, and they follow us straight into our professional lives. When your worth is constantly being proven by your achievements, the line between what you do and who you are, it just starts to dissolve. Your professional success isn't just a part of your life anymore. It becomes the very definition of your identity. You are your accomplishments. There's a clinical term for this condition. It's called emotional dependency. And let's be very clear about what this means. It's a state where your own sense of value is not self-generated. Instead, it's outsourced. It becomes entirely contingent on the feedback, the approval, and the validation you get from other people. This brings us to a really critical reframing of the whole issue. Because when we see this behavior in ourselves, or maybe in others, we often misdiagnose the problem. And that, in turn, leads to some pretty ineffective solutions. Here's the crucial distinction. The misconception is that this feeling of unease comes from a lack of ambition or maybe a need to just try harder.
But the root cause isn't about ambition at all. The real problem is the underlying emotional dependency. The drive for success is just a symptom. It's a strategy to get the validation that the self can't yet provide on its own.
And so, I'll leave you with a question for reflection. If this entire architecture we've discussed is built on an external foundation, what happens when you decide to renovate? What does it look like, and what does it feel like when your worth is no longer a variable defined by others, but a constant that you define for yourself?
We've all seen that colleague, right? The one who seems to have it all figured out. They navigate complex meetings with such ease, their contributions are always on point, and they just project this aura of unshakable self-assurance. But, this exterior confidence often hides a really complex internal process. So in this explainer, we're going to explore the mechanics of external validation.
But what if that polished exterior is actually a very carefully constructed facade? What's really happening on the inside? Let's start to peel back those layers and examine the hidden mechanics at play.
Okay, first things first. Let's talk about what we all see on the surface. This confident exterior isn't just compelling. In a professional setting, it can be incredibly effective for building influence and credibility.
The perception they project is one of complete control and unwavering self-belief. This curated image, well, it becomes a very powerful professional brand.
And this confidence is built on a set of highly valued professional traits. They're consistently visible in important discussions. They seem highly engaged, and they're exceptionally articulate. They come across as proactive in their approach and resilient, even when faced with setbacks.
All right, now let's move beyond just perception and start to decode the specific behaviors. These are the subtle signals that reveal a very different internal process at work.
Our analysis reveals 4 key behavioral patterns. First, there's a constant scanning for feedback. Second, they make strategic efforts to ensure they have high visibility. Third, there's this persistent reinforcement of their own contributions. And finally, a tendency to, overcorrect after even minor criticism.
Let's look a bit closer at that first pattern, scanning for feedback. This goes so far beyond just listening. It's an exhaustive process, replaying conversations, minutely analyzing the phrasing in an email, and trying to interpret the smallest shifts in tone for some kind of hidden meaning.
You see, the goal here isn't just to comprehend what's being said, it's a forensic analysis for social and professional approval. Every single interaction becomes data, processed for its validation content.
But these behaviors, they're really just the symptoms. To understand the cause, we have to shift from their external actions to their internal drivers. This is where the true mechanics are revealed.
And here you can see the contrast laid out. The appearance is one of strength, confidence, proactivity, resilience. But the underlying actions, that constant scanning, the maneuvering for visibility, the overcorrecting, they all suggest a very different motivation.
Internally, what's happening is they are in a constant state of negotiating for approval.
This simple phrase reframes every single action as a kind of transaction. So, speaking up in a meeting isn't just about sharing an idea, it's a bid for positive reinforcement. Making sure a project gets visibility isn't just good project management, it's a transaction designed to secure esteem.
Now, this internal state has some pretty significant consequences, particularly for anyone in a leadership role. Let's consider the professional implications for a moment.
Think about the impact this has on strategic risk-taking. If your primary driver is getting consensus and validation, what happens to the difficult, maybe unpopular, but absolutely necessary decisions?
And now think about the team. What is the long-term impact on trust and psychological safety when a leader's actions are driven by a need for approval rather than by a consistent set of principles?
This really leads us to a much larger question about leadership itself. Can authentic, lasting influence truly be built on a foundation that requires constant external validation just to stay stable?
So, to close out this analysis, I want to leave you with one final question that I think distills this entire dynamic down into a single choice. Is true influence really built on achieving consensus, or is it built on a foundation of internal conviction? It's a critical distinction for anyone who's looking to understand the real source of impactful leadership.
Today, we're going to explore the often unseen relationship between high achievement and our own internal stability. It's a dynamic that many ambitious professionals experience, but very few actually stop to analyze. So, let's start with a question to frame our thinking. What if the very drive that fuels your success is, at the same time, creating a significant point of fragility within you? All right, let's get into it with our first section, the high performance paradox. We're going to look at that common link between the desire for approval and real, measurable professional success. You know, it's something we all tend to accept as true, and for good reason. Seeking external approval can be an incredibly powerful motivator. It's what pushes us to meet deadlines, to exceed expectations, and to climb that corporate ladder. From the outside, it looks like a highly effective strategy. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because this slide reveals the central paradox we're examining. On one hand, you have the visible results, high performance, positive feedback, career momentum, they're undeniable. But on the other hand, they can mask a much more precarious reality operating just beneath the surface, a growing instability, weakened boundaries, and an emotional volatility that is tied directly to that external feedback loop. And this brings us directly to our next section, where we shift our focus from the appearance of success to its underlying psychological cost. This quote really cuts to the heart of the matter. Performance, the metric that everyone else sees, it stays high. But the trade-off is that you've effectively handed over control of your internal sense of well-being to outside forces. Your stability becomes conditional. So, what do we actually mean by externally regulated stability? Well, think of it this way. It's a state where your internal barometer, your sense of calm, your confidence, your self-worth, isn't controlled from within anymore. Instead, it fluctuates based on external events, a positive comment from a manager, a successful presentation, or, on the flip side, a single piece of critical feedback. Now, this dependency isn't just some abstract psychological concept. It starts to show up in very real and often detrimental behaviors. Let's take a look at the cracks that start to appear in the foundation. The first major consequence is a fundamental shift in how decisions are made. The guiding question is no longer, what is the right strategic course of action? Instead, it becomes, what course of action will be most approved of? This can lead to risk aversion and a slow drift away from sound, principle-based leadership. The second crack we see is boundary erosion. The fear of disapproval makes it incredibly difficult to say no, even to requests that fall well outside your strategic priorities or your capacity. This doesn't just lead to burnout, it also dilutes your focus and your effectiveness on the work that truly matters. And the third, and perhaps most noticeable, crack is emotional volatility. When your self-worth is tied to your last performance review or your latest project success, your emotional state becomes a bit of a roller coaster. Minor setbacks can feel catastrophic, while small bits of praise can bring a disproportionate sense of relief. It's a clear sign of a missing stable internal emotional baseline. This timeline really paints a clear picture of how that volatility plays out in a typical corporate cycle. You'll notice that predictable events become points of extreme emotional flux. A routine performance review can trigger significant anxiety or elation. A bit of negative feedback can cause a deep dip in morale. And something like a leadership transition introduces a profound sense of uncertainty because the very sources of validation are now in question. But here's the important part. This state, it isn't a permanent condition. The alternative lies in making a conscious effort to reclaim your internal compass. And that brings us to the crucial distinction, the two paths. The externally regulated professional is fundamentally reactive. Their motivation and actions are dictated by the perception of others and the need for approval. In contrast, the principle-driven professional is proactive. Their motivation comes from a deeply held set of internal values and a clear vision of their long-term objectives. This allows them to navigate feedback and events with a much steadier hand. So, we'll end with this question, not as a judgment, but simply as a point for reflection. Understanding your own answer to this is the first and most critical step toward building a career that isn't just successful on the outside, but one that is also stable and resilient from within. When we think about a career, we often measure growth in terms of titles or promotions or the projects we've completed. But there's another journey happening at the same time, a psychological one. And that's what we're going to explore today, the 4 stages of professional maturity. So let's start with a question, and I want you to really think about this for a moment. Where does your professional confidence actually come from? Is your sense of value based on what other people say, or is it something you hold internally? The answer to that question, well, it's at the very heart of our conversation today. That brings us to this core idea. What exactly is professional maturity? It's not something that just happens with age or experience. It's actually a deliberate psychological shift. It's about moving the source of your validation from the outside world to an anchor you hold deep inside yourself. Here's a way to define it, and the most important word on this screen is dependency. This is about reaching a state where your ability to do your job and to do it well is no longer dependent on getting a pat on the back. You become the main judge of your own value.
Now, let's be really clear about something. This journey isn't about becoming immune to feedback or suddenly disliking recognition. Of course not. Acknowledgement feels good. It's a normal part of work. The real goal here is to achieve a kind of emotional independence where you can appreciate the praise without needing it to feel competent. So, this whole evolution starts with two foundational stages. And both of them are really defined by a reliance on what other people think, although they show up in slightly different ways. As we go through them, just ask yourself if one sounds more familiar than the other. Okay, stage 1, this is where a professional craves praise. The motivation is really fueled by that positive feedback. The question you might ask yourself is, do I need to hear good work to believe that I've actually done good work? Then in stage 2, it evolves a little. Now it's about seeking reassurance. The motivation here is less about getting praise and more about calming your own self-doubt. The question becomes, do I need to hear "you're on the right track" just to silence that voice of uncertainty in my head? You can see how both are completely focused on the external. Stage 3. Now this is the turning point. This is where the center of gravity really begins to shift inward. That old dependency on what everyone else thinks starts to fade, and it's replaced by a growing trust in your own judgment. We call this the balanced performer. At this stage, you absolutely still listen to and value what others have to say, but their opinion is no longer the only thing that matters. You start weighing that outside feedback against your own increasingly confident internal assessment. The key question for this stage is, can I take critical feedback on board without it shaking my own conviction? Your performance gets a lot more consistent here because it's not being knocked around by every bit of external opinion. And that brings us to the final stage, the culmination of this whole journey. This stage is about achieving true professional autonomy, where your sense of competence is completely internalized. It's self-sustaining. The self-anchored authority operates from a solid foundation of their own hard-won experience, their competence, and their principles. Their confidence is intrinsic. And the defining question here is quite different. It's, is my professional value a settled fact that I determine, or is it still up for debate by others? A person at this stage is always open to new information, but their core professional identity, that's no longer on the table for discussion. They are their own authority. So when we put all of these pieces together, you can see the entire path of this evolution laid out. It's a clear, logical progression, from being completely dependent on others to being completely self-reliant. You see the journey from craving praise to seeking reassurance to becoming a balanced performer, and finally, to arriving as a self-anchored authority. This is the ascent that really defines professional growth. It's the shift from constantly asking, "Am I good enough?" to quietly knowing, "I am capable." This entire process, this conscious, deliberate unhitching of your self-worth from the validation of others, that is professional maturity. So we'll end right where we started, with a question for you to reflect on. As you go about your work, in those moments of success, and especially in moments of challenge, what is your professional anchor? Is it floating in the opinions of others, or is it fixed firmly within yourself?